Before I start with the Salt Dump Truck, I actually want to make a serious recommendation. Michael Acevedo is a professional poker player, author, and one of the guys behind developing piosolver, and he recently released the book Modern Poker Theory on Amazon, and for under $30, it is arguably the single best investment that you can make in your poker game. The question is not if Michael Acevedo's book is good. The question is not if it's great. The question is if it's the greatest of all time, in the running with the extremely difficult work Mathematics of Poker by Bill Chen. This is one of those books that I read and think, wow, Michael has given away way too much information, and I can't believe that this is all publicly available. But because the work is indeed complex and difficult to get through, I imagine a lot of people will just read a couple chapters and will never be able to reap the entire benefits of the book. That being said, it is unquestionably the best book written in the solver era. This book came out right after Andrew Brokos' Playing Optimal Poker, and it's essentially superior to it in absolutely every way. So hats off to Michael Acevedo for being one of the two GOATs of poker authors.
Take a look at an example here. Let's say you raise from middle position and the big blind calls. Flop comes 9 of hearts, 7 of hearts, 3 of clubs. If you run this through Equalab, you'll see you do not have a range advantage.
If you run this through Equalab, you'll see that you definitely have a range advantage here.
And you're going to find you usually don't have a range advantage as the pre-flop raiser on middle card boards, or usually very coordinated boards, unless the coordinating cards are all very high cards.
You'll find that as the pre-flop raiser, you'll have a range advantage on nearly every board where you can have sets and 2 pair, and your opponent doesn't always have all of the sets and 2 pairs. For example, your opponent might not always have pocket 9s or 9-7 here. He might 3-bet some of those.
So on 9-7-3, you're definitely not going to want to continuation bet 100% of the time against a good player.
Actually, if you're playing against piosolver, I'm pretty sure that if you bet a third of the pot here, you would lose less than 2% of EV compared to GTO.
What you want to do is you want to look at how all the hands in your range fit in with this general strategy. So, as you see here, we have the premium made hands in red, which you should bet. We have the draws in blue.
Aces, kings, and queens are not premium made hands on 9-7-3 by any stretch of the imagination, particularly if you have the ace of hearts, because if you bet and get raised, what is your opponent raising you with that you do not block?
Which you should bet. We have the marginal made hands in green, which you should check.
Actually, I think pocket 8s is a better bet on the flop than pocket aces.
And we have the junk in gray, which you should also check. So
you should check those hands.
Let's go through these really quick and make sure everything looks logical.
Okay. As you can see here, my face is very skeptical, right? The good thing about getting a webcam is you can get to see my skeptical face. Now, this is just really bad. I'm going to show you in a solver why it's really bad, but it's really, really, really bad. So, I actually had never come across Jonathan Little's material before, besides in passing. I figured that it's too remedial for me to want to study anyways. But this is really embarrassing, and even worse, it's just factually inaccurate, and even doing a cursory analysis of Jonathan's work, it seems like a lot of it doesn't even agree with itself. So let me break this down for you in our good friend piosolver, who happens to have all of the answers. So here are some pre-flop charts that you can download from Jonathan Little. I think they're part of some kind of email sign-up program. And let's go ahead and actually use the ranges that he has given us in order to see if his advice is any good. So let's examine the quality of advice based on his pre-flop guidelines instead of my pre-flop guidelines, which are better. So here in piosolver, I've inputted the suggested hijack opening range here, which includes a little bit of suited connectors and suited one-gappers, and seems fairly standard for a hijack. We open to 2.5 big blinds as recommended by Jonathan Little. And then here, out of position, we defend the big blind with the same ranges also recommended from his pre-flop charts. this weird lopsided manta ray, is indeed the same manta ray shape that you see over here. Even against the 2.5 big blind RFI, I think that this is a shockingly wide range. And in general, versus a 2.5 big blind RFI, you should be defending about the same percentage of hands that you think they're opening. So if they're opening like 30% of hands, you should be defending about 30% of hands. So if the hijack is opening like 18% of the hands here, but you're defending like 33% of hands here, I think you're playing extraordinarily loose and badly, and you're just going to be spewing a lot of money. So as this begins to solve down, let's debunk a couple of things that Jonathan Little said. First, he said as a middle position raiser that we're not going to be able to have a range advantage against the big blind caller, and using his own ranges, we can see that out of a $55 pot, we're going to be scooping $32, which is a huge win for us. And it's really hard to argue here that we do not have some sort of significant range advantage. If we go into the strategy, we can see that given the option between betting and checking, we should be betting the overwhelming majority of the time, and in fact, this seems to be a board that is a likely candidate for simplification, because as you can see, we're going to be betting 75% of the time anyways, we're generally going to be sizing up a little bit. Yeah, generally should be pushing all the equity here. Also, something that is important to notice is that earlier I thought, oh, eights is probably a better hand to bet than pocket aces, and indeed here you can see that we should be checking eights 27% of the time, but we should be checking aces close to 40% of the time. So when we are saying, oh, this is a premium made hand versus this being a premium made hand, we're still thinking about hands in terms of their pre-flop equity and not of their post-flop equity. And, you know, when there's a flop, we should talk about the equity we have on the flop. So, a couple things going on here. One, I think that these pre-flop ranges are completely absurd and are probably losing. If this is one of the most favorable boards for you in Jonathan's eyes, as you can see, you're expected to win $16.78 after you've invested another $15. So generally, when the board comes super favorable for you, you're only going to be making $1.80 in this spot. So you can imagine that when the flop comes Ace King 6, Queen Jack 2, any board that has some kind of Broadway on it, your EV is going to plummet and you're very rarely going to recover your initial investment. Let's quickly look at how much equity you would lose if you use Jonathan's post-flop strategy rather than a simplification. So using a mixed sizing, we had about a 32.77 EV, and after we simplify down, we have 32.62, which means we lose a really insignificant amount of EV if we choose to simplify on this board against such a station-y calling range. Right? Jonathan Little is teaching you how to be a station pre-flop. Let's just be real about that. So now let's break this down and use Jonathan Little's betting strategy on the flop and see how much EV it earns or sacrifices compared to GTO. Okay, this is already starting to solve down, and we can see that our EV has already plummeted from the high 32s to the low 31s. So already as a default strategy, using this weird kind of predictable mixing strategy is going to be losing you at least $1.50 off the bat. So that's like 3%. So let's look at how our opponent should adjust optimally, and they should just wildly just fold everything to you. Especially when you're picking that 75% sizing, you're making your opponent's life really, really easy when they have just random hands that don't really have that much equity. So when you have a hand like 6s, 5s, 4s, those are all really easy folds. When you have a hand like Jack 5 of spades, really easy fold. Even a hand like Ace 7 or King 7, you might call these on the flop once, but if your opponent then just barrels up again, yeah, you're probably going to fold. With such a predictable range, your opponent should be occasionally folding some of these top pair type hands. So in fact, every time that you bet so large and your opponent calls you with a hand like King 9, it's going to be pretty close for them. Although whenever a hand mixes between calling and folding, that means it's really, really close to neutral. Right? So pretty much the only mistake that you're going to get your opponent to make is sometimes they're going to call with very neutral hands. So those are going to be generally small mistakes. But then all of the other hands, you're going to make really, really obvious plays for them by betting 75% on the flop. And this is one of the reasons why I like to bet so small on the flop, because it makes none of your opponent's decisions very obvious. So here, completely broken down, 31.19 originally from 32.70, so we can see losing about 3% in a $55 pot as a default simplification. So I just want to point out the simplifications that I recommend. One, makes life more difficult for your opponent in terms of coming up with the optimal defense. It's easier to execute because you can recognize your entire range over the board rather than having to think about, oh, is this hand premium or marginal, a concept that it seems like Jonathan Little can't even understand. And my strategy against an optimal opponent actually makes more money. I ran all of the same tests using optimal GTO ranges, a range very similar to what Pluribus would open from here, a range that a cloud solution would defend with here, and pretty much this is a spot where you definitely have a range advantage, and playing such a predictable big bet versus check strategy is going to just be really, really bad. So if you are currently studying Jonathan Little's work, the good news is you have huge rooms to grow. It means that anytime that you open a solver, it's going to be a whole new world for you, and you're actually going to find that accurate play is going to disagree with what your favorite coach says an extraordinary amount of the time. It's pretty alarming and telling that just a single glance through of Jonathan's material showed that it was complete bullshit. So if you think his work is really eye-opening material for you, guess what's going to happen when you start thinking about poker in a really serious, rigorous manner. So as always, since I am another coach and I have my own instructional products, please take everything with a grain of salt. But this is why solvers are important, is that you can look at my work and you can come up with models that agree or disagree with me. Similarly, I can take your models using your information and I can wildly disagree with you because the poker strategies that you recommend are complete bullshit, Jonathan. What? Jonathan Little's like the Mike Apostle of the coaching world. Shots fired.